Today I'll be responding to a video by Capturing Christianity entitled 3 Strong Arguments Against Moral Subjectivism. Now, I should note that I'm not a moral subjectivist in the sense it's typically construed, which includes a semantic thesis, claiming that when most people use moral language, they're reporting their attitudes. While I personally do use moral language in this way, I don't take the view that this is the way most people use moral language. However, even though I'm not technically a subjectivist, I don't find the arguments from Cameron against it to be compelling. With that said, let's get on to the video.
Hey guys, it's me, Cameron Bertuzzi, here with 3 strong arguments against moral subjectivism. So this view might be popular like online and in certain atheist circles, but ethicists have known that moral subjectivism actually faces some pretty serious issues. So let's start by just laying out what the view is. Individualist moral subjectivism, it's a mouthful, is the view that our moral claims are really just descriptions of our preferences. So for example, when someone says abortion is wrong, they're really just saying, I disapprove of abortion. And on this view, and this is really important, moral claims are still true or false. So if the description of the preference is accurate, like if they actually have that preference, then the moral claim is true. But the important part here is that moral claims are still true or false. Moral subjectivism is sometimes confused with a view called emotivism. Emotivism is the view that our moral claims just reduce to expressions of emotion. So when someone says abortion is wrong, they're really just expressing an emotion like abortion, boo. And so on this view, moral claims are not actually true or false. Just like if I said chocolate ice cream, yuck, like that's not true or false, right? I'm just expressing an emotion in a language that you guys can understand. And since these two views are radically different, they require their own refutations. So if you're interested in a refutation of emotivism, then check out the blog post that I've posted in the description, 2 serious problems for emotivism. All right, so let's switch gears and turn now to the arguments against individualist moral subjectivism. The first argument is that moral subjectivism can't account for genuine moral disagreement. So it goes like this. Premise number 1. If moral subjectivism were true, then there would be no genuine moral disagreement. Premise number 2. There is genuine moral disagreement. The conclusion, therefore, moral subjectivism is not true. All right, so let's look a little closer at premise 1. If our moral claims are really just descriptions of our preferences, then there actually can't be any moral disagreement. So think about it like this. Joe says abortion is wrong, and Sally says abortion is right. So let's translate these moral claims. Joe is saying, I disapprove of abortion, and Sally is saying, I approve of abortion. But does Joe actually disagree with Sally? Actually, no. Joe would reason like this. I disapprove of abortion, and I agree that Sally approves of abortion. Likewise, Sally would say, I approve of abortion, and I agree that Joe disapproves. So on this view, as long as everyone is telling the truth, there actually isn't any disagreement. But this is all really, really strange, right? If you're pro-choice and you go into a debate with a pro-lifer, you're not going into this debate assuming that the two of you agree. Moral debate assumes disagreement, at least in principle. So if you think that you can coherently have moral debates with other people, then you have to agree that there does exist genuine moral disagreement. And from the first 2 premises, it follows that moral subjectivism is false.
I think the only reason it sounds strange to say Joe and Sally don't disagree here is because Cameron is using the word disagree to solely refer to propositional disputes, when really the term has other definitions under which Joe and Sally are disagreeing. It'd be a bit like claiming this animal is not a bat, because bat refers to a wooden implement used for hitting the ball in games. While it's true that this animal doesn't fit under the given definition of bat, it still sounds weird to claim they're not a bat, because there are other common definitions of the term bat under which they obviously would qualify. To make things more clear, let's look at a case in another normative domain. Say Joe says Marvel movies are better than DC movies, whereas Sally claims DC movies are better than Marvel movies. It seems plausible that aesthetic subjectivism is true. That when Joe and Sally make these statements, they're simply reporting their attitudes. However, under aesthetic subjectivism, the propositions expressed by both these statements are compatible with each other. There's no propositional dispute. Yet it still seems like the two disagree. This case then serves as a counterexample to the notion that disagreement solely refers to propositional disputes. Disagreement can also refer to a difference in attitudes. While Joe and Sally don't have any propositional dispute, they do have a difference in attitudes, so they still disagree.
The second argument against moral subjectivism is that it would render all of our moral judgments literally infallible. So let's look at this argument. Premise number 4. If moral subjectivism were true, then all of our moral judgments would be infallible. Premise number 5. Our moral judgments are not infallible, from which it follows the conclusion, therefore moral subjectivism is not true. So moral subjectivism implies that any moral claim that you make, any honest one, is true. Here is an analogy that might help. If I honestly report to you that my favorite ice cream flavor is vanilla, then I can't actually be wrong about that. I mean, it could be lying, but so long as I'm being honest, then I can't be wrong. So similarly, on moral subjectivism, if I honestly report to you that I disapprove of abortion, then I can't be wrong. This means that any honest moral claim that anyone makes is literally infallibly true. The obvious problem here is that it's extremely presumptuous to think that your beliefs about an entire area of discourse are literally infallibly true, especially about one as so nuanced and controversial as morality. Moreover, if everyone is literally infallible about morality, then atheists have to admit that every religious person's views ever have been infallibly correct. I'm going to let your mind wander on that one. And so it follows from premises 4 and 5 that moral subjectivism is not true.
Subjectivism does not entail that all our moral judgments are infallible. There are two ways in which people's moral judgments can still be fallible, even under subjectivism. The first way would be instances of moral judgments that are predicated on empirical errors. Take a subjectivist utilitarian who supports gun control because they believe it maximizes utility. However, it turns out that gun control actually reduces utility. It'd be perfectly coherent for such a person to say that their moral judgment was mistaken, despite him being a subjectivist. The second way would be cases where people are mistaken about their preferences. Imagine a child that believes he dislikes broccoli, when in reality it turns out that he just dislikes steamed broccoli, and he actually enjoys broccoli prepared in other ways. The child was mistaken about his preference against broccoli. Similarly, we can think of cases where someone is mistaken about their moral preferences. Someone might believe that they're a classical utilitarian, that they morally approve of all instances in which utility is maximized. However, this may be because they haven't actually thought through all the entailments of their stated view. For example, you may present them with a case in which it would maximize utility to have someone torture a child solely for the sadistic pleasure of themselves and a large group of sociopaths who are watching it. Upon hearing this, they may realize that contrary to what they thought, they don't actually approve of all instances in which utility is maximized. Now you might think, okay, but what about cases in which someone isn't mistaken about the empirical facts or their own preferences? What about cases in which empirical facts wouldn't change someone's moral judgment? Cameron gives the example of the Nazis in the comments section, saying, I am not prepared to accept that the Nazis were infallibly correct when they decided to gas women and children. We can suppose that the Nazis' support for the Holocaust isn't due to any misconception about empirical facts. Their empirical views could be completely accurate, and yet they'd still support putting Jews in gas chambers. Similarly, they're not mistaken about their moral preferences. They've thought through all the entailments of their stated view and concluded that yes, they really do approve of killing Jews. Does this mean the Nazis' moral judgment was infallibly correct? If a Nazi were to proclaim the Holocaust was good, it is true that a subjectivist would technically be committed to saying that the truth value of this proposition is true. However, it's important to be clear about what saying this proposition is true actually amounts to on subjectivist semantics. Since subjectivists take moral statements to simply be descriptions of attitudes, saying this proposition is true just amounts to saying it's true that Nazis approve of the Holocaust. Nothing about subjectivism, however, precludes one from morally condemning Nazis or saying that their actions were wrong. One can acknowledge that Nazis approve of the Holocaust while still disapproving of their approval. It's also worth noting that even moral realists would have to admit that the statement, the Holocaust was good, as uttered by a subjectivist Nazi, would technically be true if such a statement were uttered by a fellow moral realist that just so happens to also be a Nazi. Then the realist could say the statement is false. But if a Nazi is a subjectivist, and hence when they say the Holocaust was good, they just mean, I approve of the Holocaust, then even moral realists would be dedicated to saying that this statement is true. To deny that this proposition is true would amount to saying it's false that the Nazi approves of the Holocaust, which would obviously be absurd.
So let's turn to the third argument. This one says that moral subjectivism is incoherent. It goes like this. Premise number 7. If moral subjectivism were true, then there would be true contradictions. Premise number 8. There are no true contradictions. From there it follows, moral subjectivism is not true. So let's start first with the concept of a contradiction. Here's one. Cameron is a photographer and Cameron is not a photographer. That sentence actually contains an explicit contradiction, so it can't be true. I can't be a photographer and not a photographer at the same time. Okay, so the idea behind the third argument is that our preferences are not always rational. So for example, suppose that Frank thinks that it's always wrong to eat meat. But then suppose that Frank has other preferences that would make eating meat morally acceptable, like his desire not to starve to death. Combining these preferences together, we arrive at Frank never approves of eating meat, and Frank sometimes approves of eating meat. So here's where it gets really interesting. Remember that on moral subjectivism, our moral claims are true or false descriptions of our preferences. And so long as those descriptions are accurate, then the moral claim must be true. That's just what moral subjectivism is. So let's see what happens when we translate Frank's conflicting preferences into a moral claim. It is always wrong to eat meat, and it is not always wrong to eat meat. Moral subjectivism implies that this moral claim has to be true. Again, that's what the view is. However, this claim is obviously contradictory, and so it can't be true. Like, there's no possible world where this claim is true. This is a very, very serious problem. No human's moral preferences are perfectly rational. I mean, we all try to be like as rational as we can, but even professional philosophers have a difficult time weeding out little incoherencies in their beliefs. So unless we grant the really implausible premise that no one that's ever lived has had contradictory preferences about morality, then moral subjectivism implies that some contradictions are true. But since there obviously can't be any true contradictions, it follows that moral subjectivism is not true.
No, subjectivism does not entail true contradictions. There are two plausible interpretations of what's going on with Frank here, and neither of them involve contradictions. First of all, Cameron seems to use conflicting preferences and contradictory preferences synonymously here, but it's important to note preferences can be conflicting without being contradictory. Let's say I have a taste preference to eat vegan cookies and a health preference not to eat vegan cookies. This is not a logical contradiction. So Frank could have a moral preference for people to never eat meat, and a prudential preference to sometimes eat meat. Again, there's no contradiction here. And ethical subjectivism is going to be about moral preferences, not just any type of preference you have. If you have a preference to not eat bananas because you think they taste gross, that doesn't mean as a subjectivist you're committed to saying it's morally wrong for you to eat bananas. So if Frank's preference to not starve to death is a non-moral preference, that's going to be pretty important because it's going to mean that such a preference doesn't make it morally permissible to eat meat in order to avoid starving to death. Second of all, it could be the case that Frank is just mistaken about his preferences, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Frank may believe that he has the moral preference for people to never eat meat, but it could be the case that in reality he actually has the moral preference for people to not eat meat in typical circumstances. Now, if the anti-subjectivist wants to maintain that there is a contradiction here, that's actually going to pose a serious problem for them. If the propositions it's never okay to eat meat, and it's sometimes okay to eat meat, constitute a contradiction, then the propositions Frank never approves of eating meat, and Frank sometimes approves of eating meat, must also constitute a contradiction, since on subjectivist semantics, these are the same set of propositions. If it is a contradiction, then Cameron's proposed counterexample to subjectivism is logically impossible, and thus doesn't constitute a legitimate objection. And if it isn't a contradiction, it doesn't demonstrate that subjectivists are committed to true contradictions, and so the objection fails.
Alright guys, that does it for this video on 3 strong arguments against moral subjectivism.
Well, I wouldn't exactly use the word strong to describe those arguments, but, Anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope I've showed why Cameron's objections to subjectivism fail.